Session is being recorded. I'll go back there and make sure the feeds come up. I'll give you a thumbs up.
Great. Welcome everyone to the Trek Friday Transportation Seminar, our second to the last session of the year, of the spring at least, and we'll be returning in the fall. Today we have two of our own graduate students, transportation graduate students, one from civil engineering and one in urban studies. So we'll have a slightly different format. We'll have two speakers, one for the first half hour and one for the second half hour. Our first presenter is David Soto Padin, earning a master's in civil engineering. He'll be talking about transit and bike share integration. Our second speaker will be Michael Harpool. He's earning a master's in urban studies, and he'll be talking about utilitarian skateboarding. David? So we'll have about 20 minutes for the presentations and about 10 minutes for Q&A after each one, and then we'll switch.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be able to have this opportunity to present what I've been working on for my master's project with all of you. I have always shared an interest in bike share and rail transit integration. And so my MS project will focus on looking at this type of transportation, these types of transportation systems in the United States. So as part of my presentation, I'm going to give a brief introduction, talk about mention what my research question is, talk about what these terms mean, bike share and rapid rail transit, brief literature review, and go into basically everything I worked on for the project, methodology, model development, and potential applications of this research. Some terms you should know, rapid rail transit, what I'm referring to there is light rail and heavy rail transit systems that have frequencies of more than 15 minutes or more, or better. And what I mean by bike share is the types of, the systems of public bicycles that you're maybe familiar with, that you can check out with your phone. When I refer to stations, I'm referring to rapid rail stations, and then when I'm talking about docks, I'm talking about basically bike share stations, but they're called docks essentially. NACTO is National Association of City Transportation Officials, and FTA is Federal Transit Administration. So briefly about me, I got my bachelor's at University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez. And last summer, I got to go on the Netherlands study abroad that PSU hosts with IBPI. And when I went over there, I basically discovered the full potential of combining these two types of transportation modes. Really, what I have found is that the success of the Netherlands is greatly due to their very sophisticated and rapid rail transit systems. So that was part of the big inspiration. Here I am in the Netherlands riding a public bike called OV-Fiets. So, and here's Bike Town and Lime Bike, if you're not familiar with them. So brief introduction. Again, what is bike and ride, or combining bicycle and rail-based means of transportation? It can take many forms. Transit agencies are trying what they're calling bicycle rail transit integration, whether it's through bicycle parking, bicycle paths next to along rail corridors, bikes on trains, as this photo shows from the MAX light rail system, and bike share stations located directly outside of rail systems. So these are just a few ways that transit agencies in the United States are trying to integrate the bicycle. It's a widely held policy to try to integrate the bicycle. I've looked through all the transit agencies and I don't see anyone that does that in any way or shape or form prohibits bikes from combining with rail, like whether it's taking the bike on the train. Certain systems will restrict during rush hours, but essentially all transit agencies in the United States favor using the bicycle. favor promoting bicycle plus transit trips. So some examples of how this could be, how these trips can be, what's the purpose of these trips, how these trips can be useful. Say like your train line, the trains you take every day has its service disruption. Well, somewhere like in Washington, D.C., that's very, it's convenient to have bike share stations along transit lines because people have an alternative to taking the train. Or say I'm going to PSU in the morning and the weather's nice, but in the afternoon it starts raining. That's where this kind of bike share and trans integration can be useful in promoting sustainable and active transportation modes. In the same way, you can have just first mile bicycle trips and then take the train for the rest of your journey, or you can just use the bike when you get to your destination train station and then use it to get to work. There's many ways of doing of bike and ride. These are just a few examples. My research question is basically concerning, from the transit agency's standpoint, how does bike share have an effect on my performance on the average boardings at my train stations? So that's what I'll be looking at. And we're considering both heavy and light rail systems, but not commuter rail and not streetcar systems. So some of the reasons, again, for doing this, it's a phenomenon that hasn't been studied as much as it should be, and it holds potential for being very beneficial to society at large, for governments and institutions to incorporate these kinds of policies into their planning frameworks. So what I'm hoping is my research can shed light on this phenomenon. And of course, we can also, the model that I'm developing can potentially be used to help bike share planning agencies or bike share companies estimate the impact of deploying bike share to rapid rail transit stations, as I'll allude to later. So again, the focus of this project is exclusively on dock-based systems. In the US, over the last year, dockless systems have exploded in demand. And for both obvious reasons, we don't have 2017 data, but also we want to make, we wanted to analyze bike share's effect on rail transit stations. So having dock-based systems was obviously a much better way of doing the analysis. But again, it was also because there was no data, so for dockless systems. And as I mentioned, I'm only considering heavy and light rail systems, so not including like Amtrak and other commuter rail systems. Brief literature review. Singleton and Clifton, researchers from here from PSU, they had established in 2013. They had documented this kind of synergy between the bicycle and rail. Specifically, they went into, they explored how providing rail service has other benefits other than just like the obvious connection between bicycle and rail. Like I bike to the station and then I take the train. They looked at other types of synergies, like long-term synergies, like I was mentioning, in terms of if I have a flat tire, having that backup system was very important. Martin and Shaheen in 2014 established that it's possible that in lower densities, bike share trips would substitute, bike share trips would substitute car trips, but in higher density urban cores, bike share trips could substitute transit trips. And then Ma and Liu from University of Maryland did a study where they looked at boardings, transit boardings, and bike share trips in Washington, D.C. So it was a one city study, but it's basically one of the studies that I'm modeling my research on, because, but basically it's the only study that I found that looks at the relationship between transit boardings and bike share trips, but it only focused on one city. So the purpose of this project is to expand on that and do more cities to create a more robust model. So we looked at the cities in the US with both rapid rail transit and bike share systems. And based on the data availability, we narrowed the list down to 10 cities, as shown in this map. And these are the 10 cities. Some cities have both heavy rail and light rail systems, and some cities just have light rail, like Portland, Minneapolis, and Denver. And other cities just have heavy rail, like Chicago, Philadelphia, New York City, and Washington, D.C. So you can see how we're basically, we're combining a lot of we're combining a lot of different systems, but it was also based on data availability. We do have data on ridership at heavy rail and light rail, but we don't have data on streetcar systems, for example, based on the fare validation methods. In terms of size of bike share systems, notice that New York City's bike share ridership is 4 times as much as the number 2 and number 3 cities, Chicago and Washington, D.C. So New York City is definitely going to stand out as an outlier. I mean, as a stand out as the city with the most bike share trips by far. And some of the variables I was collecting, basically at a 0.33 mile buffer, we looked at socioeconomics and built environment. Our data sources were smart location database for the built environment. That's 2012 data, but we also got 2016 data in terms of accessibility to jobs via transit. And for instance, socioeconomic variables are from the ACS 5-year estimates. And we basically had 2016 data for everything except the smart location database, which are the built environment variables. Our dependent variable is boardings, average weekday boardings. We really had to go to every transit agency website and download Excels and PDFs. It was very inconsistent and time-consuming process, but we have that data now. And at 0.1 mile buffer level, basically narrowing it down to capture the bike share system characteristics. So how many docks are within a 0.1 mile buffer of a transit station? It's important to narrow that down because people won't be as inclined to walk 1/3 of a mile versus it being just outside the transit station. And we also captured bicycle facilities, so the number of miles of bike lanes and trails. And we also got station level characteristics, so number of lines coinciding at a station and transfer points. This is an example, Clinton Station in Chicago. So we'll capture the bike share system characteristics, which is located directly under the station, as shown in this picture. And we'll also capture all the transit line characteristics. So we have 2 lines, how many boardings are at the station, and we also have this commuter rail transfer that we'll capture in the model. This is just a box plot of our observations of average weekday boardings, excluding 17 outliers. Outliers, for example, like New York City, that has stations with 200,000 boardings per day. Like, it's amazing. And divided by, in red, heavy rail, and in, I'm gonna say turquoise, light rail. So you have an idea of, again, you can see New York City standing out, and as well as the heavy rail systems, DC and San Francisco also kind of standing out. So a lot of the model development was a lot of GIS application, trying to capture buffers around stations. This is an example of Chicago, what that looks like. And this is bike share trips to boardings for Chicago. You can see, so the bigger the circle, the more lines are at a station, and that there is a sort of upward trend between bike share trips and average weekday boardings at stations. So the results of my model are shown here. I basically, the 30 plus variables that I collected, as I was mentioning earlier, were reduced with generalized linear mixed model forward and backward selection to these. And then from that first model, then we reduced it to only having the significant variables and eliminating correlations, for example. So the significant variables in the final model were heavy rail, the heavy rail flag, so whether the station is a heavy rail or not. Activity density, which refers to the density of jobs plus population plus households in a census block group. Number of bike share docks within 0.1 mile buffer. And commuter rail transfer flag, which again, as I discussed, is the presence of a commuter rail at least within a block or directly connected to the rapid rail transit station number of rapid rail lines. Total system ridership for 2016, and that's reported in millions, so you can see why it would be 10 to the -6 there. And percent non-white population, those were the significant variables in the final model. So basically, the signs make sense, the direction of influence makes sense. The only thing I was kind of expecting percent non-white to be negative because of what's been shown. But at the same time, it makes sense because percent non-white population is correlated with many other variables such as income that will explain the number of boardings at transit stations. So in conclusion, the model demonstrates that accounting for many other types of variables such as built environment and socioeconomics associated with transit ridership, bike share does seem to have, the presence of bike share systems does seem to have an effect on average weekday boardings. We would like to provide, we would like to establish that based on this evidence, which is not just from this project, but many others, public policy should support technical activities related to bike share system planning, maybe by transit agencies, such as through the FTA, for example. And again, potential applications of this research can include, for example, if we were to expand Biketown in Portland, or if bike share were to expand in any other city outside the urban core along rapid rail transit lines, these models could be used to estimate what those impacts could look like, how many bikes do I need to provide, how many, what's going to be that $ investment, what are the costs and benefits of that. So I think I finished a little early, but that is my presentation. Any questions about the methodology or the results? Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's public, but I know that there's bike count data for bikes that were parked and not docked. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you were doing, I know you did multiple cities, but if you were doing so in Portland, would you change your, what would you change about your model to account for, like, or what would you have to work with, like, dockless?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would have to take a look at what the proportion of those trips that do not dock at fixed stations, what that looks like, to kind of make a better judgment call on that. But for sure, this data sometimes comes it does come with the latitude and longitude of the drop-off area. So what you can do as well is kind of match the latitude and longitude and use that to create your data set on locations where people, and if a location is used often, it'll show up as, a significant number of trips are happening here. And if it doesn't, then we can just sort it out. But based on the data I got, we just used the station and the docks level observations. So. Mm-hmm.
Were there any systems, I know that there's been talks in Portland about connecting transit passes to bike share accounts. Were there any cities that you came across that were already doing that? And was that a different, like a whole different layer of data that gave you information?
Yeah, my project is, it's looking at a lot of things. Unfortunately, with the time limit, I couldn't present all of it. But basically, yeah, Los Angeles is the first system in the US to integrate the payment for for the bike share to the metro system. And it's partly because the Metropolitan Transit Agency of Los Angeles is the owner of the bike share system. They paid for it. So that is a unique opportunity there, and they took advantage of it. Other systems are looking at it, but basically, because it was just one city, we're going to look a little more in depth at Los Angeles, but we really couldn't generalize across the population. But yeah, it's happening, and in other, in Asia, it's much more prevalent. In China, it's much more prevalent to have that kind of integration. But it's the future.
So do you see what do you see the relationship being between bike share and like fixed route bus? Because clearly a train can't displace a train with a bike share route, but like bus routes are displacing rides via bike share. So do you see that as supportive or detracting from fixed route?
So there's.
Sorry.
Quickly repeat the question.
The core question is like bike share. You're concluding that bike share supports ridership on rail.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's the same or different relationship with bus?
So that's a good question. One of the researchers from the Netherlands, they looked at the NS rail system. They were kind of making the conclusion that if your journey by rail is more than 30 miles, it is conducive. It is more likely that you'll make this kind of trip chaining event. Just based on my kind of general knowledge, I was excluding streetcars for kind of the same reason as I'm excluding bus systems. Bus systems in the US have very frequent stops. And sometimes, that will make it more likely for you to take, for you not to combine.
And does that affect the ability to use bike share or access?
Yeah, so have not looked at that aspect, that dimension of how the occupancy of the dock varies throughout the day. We don't really have that data. There is a way to get the data, but because this is historical data, there would be no way of knowing that based on the data we have. I will say though, just again, anecdotally, when we were in the Netherlands, we were programmed to be on a bike share trip and it had to be canceled because by 10 a.m., the 2,000 plus bike shares they have at the rail station were just checked out. So what I'm saying is if we continue investing or exploring these kinds of policies, we could end up getting to a world where we break that 10% bicycle mode share because of these kinds of trip chaining events that occur, bicycle plus rail. So, you know, I will say there's a way to do it. You just kind of have to set a code to capture the data, which comes in a GeoJSON format. So you just have to set for every minute for it to pull the data from the server, and then you'll have so much data. But we don't have that data, so that could look at that aspect.
I guess we have a few more minutes. I have more questions online if anyone else has any. Okay, one is, although you had intersection density as a proxy for probably bikeability in a way,
Yeah.
but were there other variables that you couldn't include but that would have talked about the quality of the bike network?
That's a great question.
Yeah,
that's a great question. I would have liked to just include protected separated bike facilities. Unfortunately, data inconsistencies did not allow for that in the short amount of time that I had to work on this, but it would definitely be the one thing that I would love to improve upon. The other thing is I'm trying to add bike mode share by city as well to the model. I just want to say as well, before I forget, major thanks to the Dwight Eisenhower Graduate Fellowship for supporting this research. As part of the project, I'm also working on a second model where we predict bike share activity, bike share trips, average weekday bike share trips. And so the bike percentage, bike mode share, bike to work mode share would go into that model. And these models will complement each other because you can use the model I talked about today to estimate the number of bicycles you have to provide at a station, and then you can use the second model to predict the level of trips, the level of activity, and then you can kind of complement the two models. But yeah, I'm working on these two kinds of approaches to this question.
thanks so much.
Thank you.
I'll introduce you.
You have to switch it back. One back.
I'll introduce Michael.
And then switch this back. Is there a receiver? I could not take.
Great, just in case people join late, I just want to introduce our second speaker. Michael Harpool is earning his master's degree in urban studies here at PSU.
All right, everyone. Hello, my name is Michael Harpool. I'm a Master of Urban Studies student here, graduating in June. And I am here to present my master's research titled Utilitarian Skateboarding, Insight into an Emergent Mode of Mobility. Before I get going, I'd like to give a thanks to my committee members, Professor Jennifer Dill, Aaron Golub, and Naomi Adiv. All right, so why skateboarding transportation? So in recent decades, planning and research efforts to enhance active transportation have grown significantly. However, these efforts have been primarily focused on bicycling and walking, and they neglect other modes of transportation such as skateboarding, scootering, and rollerblading. For what information does exist on skateboarding transportation, there are large knowledge gaps, which this study seeks to address. So some of those knowledge gaps include the social factors for choosing to travel by skateboard, skateboarders' use of existing transportation facilities, and the value attributed to those facilities, the differences between populations of skateboarders, especially considering gender. I also sought to provide a report which could inform future transportation policy and promote more inclusive transportation networks by accommodating users not typically considered by decision makers. And finally, and maybe most importantly, is my personal connection to skateboarding. For the past 16 years, skateboarding has been a huge part of my life and always my preferred mode of travel. So the Federal Highway Administration says a clear understanding of the factors which may affect an individual's decision to bike or walk is an essential prerequisite for designing policies which can tap latent demand for non-motorized travel. So this study seeks to do this for skateboarding. So the contribution of existing literature. Given the lack of a strong theoretical and empirical grounding of the travel behavior of skateboarders, I relied heavily on what existed on bicycles and pedestrians. There is a handful of studies on the spatial politics of skateboarding, which contributed greatly to my understanding of skateboarding in urban spaces and the spatial tactics used by agencies to govern the behavior and actions of skateboarding or skateboarders. Finally, the existing literature on utilitarian skateboarding. So in the United States, this academic field kind of started in the early 2010s with Tessa Walker, who is actually a master's student here as well, and she did her master's thesis on this. And then Kevin Fang from UC Davis. He did his PhD, and a lot of subsequent papers have been published from that work. So as of now, there's some work on the prevalence of skateboarding, regulations which control spatial behavior, and then safety and speed. Interestingly, he found that skateboarders travel at an average of 9 miles per hour, which is only 2 miles per hour lower than bicyclists at 11. Then mode choice and route choice. And it's important to note that those papers that came out in 2017 from Fang's PhD work were collaborative work with Susan Handy as well. So my research questions, I'm just gonna read through these really quickly. What are the key motivations and barriers to utilizing skateboarding as a mode of transportation? What are the social, legal, and environmental factors that impact route choice amongst utilitarian skateboarders? How do skateboarders utilize and value existing transportation facilities? And how does comfort differ between facilities? And then do the answers to these questions differ in accordance with skateboarders' personal characteristics, i.e. gender, skill, and frequency of use? And if so, why? So just an important note on that, I utilized these three in my thesis, but for time's sake today, I will only be going into gender and frequency of use. So my methodology, I utilized a mixed method approach with a dominant, less dominant design. So the dominant segment of this study was the quantitative. So I utilized an online survey, and the less dominant was qualitative, and that was semi-structured interviews. So it also happened sequentially. So after I got the results from my online survey, I did a preliminary analysis, which fed back into how I structured the questions of the semi-structured interviews. And then those results and analyses helped me enhance the ecological validity of my survey results. So recruitment, how did I get participants? I did a lot of in-person intercepts in Portland, Oregon. So just skateboarding around and riding the max a lot and looking for people carrying longboards or skateboards. Then I utilized various social media platforms, such as Facebook or Twitter. Meetings with local skate shop managers, especially helpful was Daddy's Board Shop up in North Portland. And flyers were distributed around PSU in key locations within Portland. And for the surveys only, I emailed the link out to relevant organizations and agencies such as the Northwest Skate Coalition, and then just some general pedestrian-friendly organizations around the country. And then all of this led to snowball sampling. So those who are interested could pass it on. So my responses for the survey, shown geographically over here. There was 390 responses of people over the age of 18. I did that to expedite the the IRB process so I could get moving, institutional review board, so I could get moving on my research. But that's a major limitation because a large part of the skateboarding population is children. And then I have 28 incomplete surveys, but they were deemed acceptable past a certain point of completion, and 92% within the United States. And you can see that there's a large cluster around Portland, Oregon, where it was studied here, so might be oversampled. The interviews, so I did 5 30-minute interviews with participants, and all of those participants lived within Portland. So get into some of the results. So just a few selected demographics. The study was, or the survey respondents were 86% male, 13% female, and then 1% non-binary. This might seem like a very large gap, but it's actually a higher percentage of females found in previous studies. So race and ethnicity, respondents were predominantly white. And then other 2 or more races had 11%, Hispanic or Latino 8%, Asian 4%, and Black or African American was 1%. And as you can see in the top right over here, predominantly respondents were between the ages of 18 and 24. However, we have 20% of respondents over the age of 35, which was pretty surprising. And then 3/4 of the respondents were employed full-time or part-time, and 20% were in school only. So skill and experience. Again, skill was important to my thesis because it was one of the variables that I used to disaggregate the data. But respondents were most likely to report being intermediate or advanced, with only 8% reporting being a beginner and 7% reporting being an expert. And over on the right-hand side, we see the age started skateboarding by age group, and then that is split up into age started for recreation and age started for transportation. What's interesting here, and found in previous studies as well, is that the average age for starting skateboarding and recreation are the same. However, starting for transportation is a total of 4 years older. So it demonstrates that there's generally a gap between the time you start skateboarding for recreation and the time you start skateboarding for transportation, where there could be skill development or just realizing the mobility benefits of skateboarding. So skateboarding frequency and the type of trips made by skateboard. So here, what's important to note is that the green represents frequent skateboarders. I focus in my study on the transportation aspect of this, but we see that participants were more like, or 22% of the participants skateboarded for transportation 5 or more days per week, which is greater than the 17% who skated 5 or more days per week for recreation. And then over here, we see that exercise and recreation was the largest trip or most common trip type. However, we see across the board that skateboarding can be used for many destination-oriented and utilitarian purposes. So the respondents were asked what type of skateboard they use. This is just a visual graphic here of the different types of skateboard that I offered. And then I also offered electric, but so you can see it at the bottom over there. That was only, so here, let me just back up a second. So 6% of the population reported using penny or cruiser boards, 15% reported using skateboards, and then 42% reported using longboards. And then there was another 37% who reported having multiple types that they use for transportation purposes. And then at the bottom there, 8 people or 6% of that 145 utilized an electric skateboard. But this just goes to show that if someone has multiple types of skateboards, they're likely to use it depending on the type of trip they're making, the distance of the trip, and so on. And then here you see average distance at the bottom in miles. So just by far, longboarders are willing to travel the longest distance compared to riders of any other types of skateboards. And there's a large number of longboarders within the multiple types category, so that you also see a jump in that category as well. So get into mode choice. So what are the primary motivations? Fun and enjoyment was by far the most commonly selected answer to this. They were allowed to select and rank only 3. So that was chosen by 81%. And for most skateboarders, travel is not a disutility to be minimized, which contributes to the contestation of Utilitarian and Solomon that travel is not a derived demand. And then this is unsurprising given the inherent link to recreation as well. Convenience was the next important. Frequent utilitarian skateboarders were significantly more likely to cite this as a motivation, and this probably has to do with the familiarity of skateboarding and understanding the unique challenges of the city. And there are also different elements of convenience mentioned by interviewees, but also by survey respondents and open-ended questions. And these include multimodal transportation. It's interesting because this is not just getting on a bus or taking with you in a car or on the train, but also had to do with becoming a pedestrian in different ways and being like one of the only other types of mode that you can bring on a bicycle. So someone mentioned utilizing it with bike share and putting it in the basket and riding along on his way, and then skateboarding for the shorter purposes. And then flexibility, maneuverability, and control. And I'll get into that a little bit later. They're easy to store and carry, so you can take them into the shopping market without having to lock it up outside. And you can put it in the back of the class without worrying about it getting stolen. And then they're really convenient for short urban trips. So, trips around your neighborhood, going to the grocery store, going to the post office, or what have you. And then the final one is lifestyle. So males were 2 times more likely to select this as a motivation. Females often face additional barriers to entry within the skateboarding culture, and that was found by Beal in 1996. So the males tend to reinforce these social barriers that inhibit the use by females sometimes. And then this is the first study to highlight the important role of lifestyle and how it differs between populations. And other studies, in fact, have not found any significant relationship between lifestyle and mode choice. What might deter skateboarders for a given trip? So here, the top 3 would be poor road sidewalk conditions, wet and slick conditions, and then distance. But we also have nearly a third of the population citing that regulations against skateboarding will make it so they don't want to utilize skateboarding as a mode of travel for any given trip, which is pretty significant and something we don't see as much in the bicycle and pedestrian literature. And also traffic is very important. So route choice. On the left-hand side, we have desired features, and on the right-hand side, we have avoided features. So they were asked whether they desired something, somewhat desired it, it didn't matter to them, or was desired or strongly desired, or avoided, highly avoided. So across the board on the top, we have smooth surface conditions and rough surface conditions. So that just shows how significant the road conditions are to skateboarding because of the smaller sized wheels. It can cause a lot of trouble. And then another really desired feature was gentle downhill slopes. And then we have infrastructure like wide sidewalks and streets with designated bike lanes. And then right below the infrastructure, we see this various fun features to skate. So I'll refer to that as micro features, and I'll go into it a little bit more, but that's one of my more interesting findings. I believe that such a high value is attributed to that. And then on the other side, so avoided, we have top 3, rough surface conditions, steep uphill slopes, and high volume of traffic. So you might notice that these route barriers are similar to the mode choice deterrence, and that's found also in the bicycle and pedestrian literature as well. So micro features. Micro features include obstacles that may be used by recreational skateboarders, such as embankments, small ledges, and staircases. Fang and Handy in 2017, they found that skateboard commuters tend to travel in straight lines and refrain from performing stunts. I believe that this is most likely in cases where there are a few micro features, bike lanes, like in bike lanes in streets, or where there is heavy traffic or of any sort, so whether that be pedestrian traffic or motor vehicle traffic. One respondent said, if you're using it for a mode of transportation and you're in those bike lanes, just going where you gotta go, we're gonna be moving at the same flow as cyclists. However, the high value attributed to routes consisting of micro features is representative of the playful interaction between skateboarders and the built environment. These interactions are not likely to be risky or flamboyant during travel, rather quick and subtle with the goal of continuous forward movement. One respondent said, I can jump off the sidewalk, jump back on the sidewalk. If there's a 3-stair, I can keep riding over it and do a little trick for fun. Route preferences by groups. So female and infrequent skateboarders attributed a higher value to features that might enhance safety. So those include wide sidewalks, designated bike lanes, and low-speed streets. And male infrequent utilitarian skateboarders placed a higher value on features that pertain more to fun, enjoyment, and thrill. So these include micro features in steep downhill slopes, which if you remember, kind of was a little strange, over here with the split. Some felt it was really desired, but a larger portion felt it was, avoided. Another portion said it was desired. So when controlling for skill and gender, when controlling for skill in a binary logistic regression, gender was a significant indicator of the desire for hills, which is consistent with the study that found male skateboarders are more likely to identify and engage in risk-taking behavior than females in the skateboarding culture. Facility use and comfort. So here they were asked whether they ride on sidewalks, bike lanes, motor vehicle, traffic lanes more often, or if they ride on them equally. And the respondents came back and said that they utilize all three equally. So possible explanations for this is the variance in surface conditions and traffic levels can encourage skateboarders to select a facility which best accommodates a comfortable level or comfortable travel. Some skateboarders are aware of the prohibitions and abide by traffic laws, resulting in a shift from between facilities. And then the presence of different facilities varies from street to street, requiring skateboarders to rely on those which are available. So in this part, females were significantly more likely to report utilizing sidewalks more often than other facilities. So this is consistent with the preference of female cyclists for separated facilities. So on-street comfort levels, here we have I asked their comfort levels on 3 different facilities: quiet residential street with speeds 20 to 25, neighborhood commercial shopping street with traffic speeds 25 to 30, and a major urban or suburban street with traffic speeds of 30 to 40. So they were asked to report very uncomfortable to very comfortable, or 1 to 4. And the mean comfort level on residential streets is fairly high, even without a bicycle route markings. But once you add those bicycle route markings, it brings it up almost to a very comfortable comfort level. And then as speed increased above 25 miles per hour, comfort levels decreased significantly. But we also see a significant rise in the importance of the bike lanes. Females and infrequent utilitarian skateboarders felt significantly less comfortable on faster streets or those without designated bike lanes. So in conclusion, just to get back to my questions, what are the key motivations and barriers to utilizing skateboarding as a mode of transportation? I found that those motivations are fun and enjoyment, convenience, and lifestyle. And then the barriers are poor infrastructure, wet and extreme weather conditions, distance, and regulations. The social, legal, and environmental factors for route choice include surface conditions, traffic, and slope. However, skateboarders value safe, comfortable, and aesthetic places to travel, and they also value the presence of micro features along routes. How do skateboarders utilize and value existing transportation infrastructure, and how does comfort differ between facilities? So skateboarders place a high value on those facilities designed for bicyclists and pedestrians. However, they tend to change with the speed of the adjacent traffic. And for the last question, yes, different groups of skateboarders value different attributes of skateboarding, prefer different routes, and are also deterred by different barriers and even more barriers. These differences are included or influenced by familiarity, skill levels, and varying concerns for safety and thrill consistent with the pedestrian and bicycle literature. Planning implications. So acknowledge skateboarding as a mode of transportation. Portland skateboarders attributed a high value to the recognition of skateboarding, and I believe that improved their experiences greatly. Include skateboarding in travel surveys and bike counts and the such, so more data will allow cities to better understand and address the needs and desires of skateboarders. Revisit and attempt to disentangle spatial skateboarding regulations with consideration for how they might impact skateboarding travel. Set clear standards on where skateboarders can and cannot ride, and educate enforcement officers, but also the general public to reduce any tension. And they must consider the differences and preferences by comfort level, skill, and gender. And it was noted in the interviews that skateboarders do not require or even ask for their own space. They just want to be accepted within the spaces that are already there for pedestrians, bicyclists, and motor vehiclists. And then we could also do safety and education courses. I would argue that these should be done both in the recreation setting and as well as the transportation-oriented setting, so like the public streets, just because recreation, you know, it's a good place to learn these fundamental skills, but then there also are like a lot of fundamental unique challenges within traveling on the street that they should be adapted to. And then considering skateboarders in complete streets and bicycle pedestrian infrastructure projects. So in the words of Elaine Stratford, there's a need to consider how to create generous geographies that allow for more and playful mobilities in the city, no matter how modest. And then future research. What are the barriers for individuals who do not utilize skateboarding as a mode of transportation currently? What are the perceived benefits of younger populations? So addressing my key limitation in the study. And that could be helpful for safe routes to school. And how is skateboarding currently perceived within public planning agencies? And are their needs and desires being considered by decision makers? How does the presence of skateboarders impact the comfort levels of people on the facilities? And how do you encourage mixed use on transportation facilities originally designed for a specific user? And then how might electric skateboards mitigate some of the fundamental barriers to skateboarding transportation? Sorry, I went a couple minutes over. Any questions? Hey.
I'm curious about the last question that you posed there with electric skateboards.
Yeah.
And seeing goes around more and more. So from some of the responses that you received, what sort of impacts do you think they'll have in overcoming barriers? And do you perceive any conflicts between the electric and non-electric skateboard community and even infrastructure?
Yes, for sure. So because all of the electric skateboarder users had also reported using other types of skateboarding, it was impossible to parse that out. But you know, just from my personal experience, and they go really, really fast, and I think it splits the gap even more. So making sidewalks a less legitimate place for them to be, and then increasing their danger because they're still really vulnerable on the streetscape or the roadway. So yeah, there will be challenges. And then as far as the cultural thing, the differences within the skateboarding realm. Yeah, but I think, there's definitely, a great way to get around, and there's definitely a spot for them. There needs to be safety and policies which support their use, and infrastructure changes as well. Dave?
So the recognition factor that when people say that, skateboarders say that when they are recognized as commuters, that it kind of surprises them. It reminds me of other communities where cycling is still viewed as a sport.
Right.
I was going to ask you really quickly, Do you think that now with scooters emerging, do you think scooters are more like skateboards or like bicycles? Because scooters are two-wheel vehicles.
Well, so I think I think they would be grouped more into like this more like playful category with skateboards, and their wheel sizes are more similar. However, there's a much smaller learning curve, so they might even be more adaptable at the widespread than skateboarding. But as far as I think the route choice factors, if you were to go into that, it would probably be more based on the skateboarding literature than it would be the bicycling literature at this time. The motivation and the distance, I did not explore that, but that's very interesting. So I did not use the distance willing to travel as a way to disaggregate the data, but I think that'd be something to look at. It would be interesting. Yeah.
When you were giving the average distances,
yep.
were those by trip or by day?
So this is going to be by day. So how long are you willing to travel in a typical day?
If you look at any relationships between how much like a skateboard costs versus using other modes of transportation?
No, so I spoke during my interviews, this came up. I didn't ask any like economic questions about how much they spend in the survey, but with interviewees, it's because, especially if you buy it for transportation, it's going to last a very long time if you're not beating it up. So the costs are going to be much lower than you would spend on, a typical bicycle, even, a lesser grade bicycle. Hi.
I can't help but think back to 2 weeks ago whenever the seminar had someone from the Netherlands that was in a country that boasts their bike facilities, like in the news photo. And there's a push in the US to have separate facilities because the research is saying that's what's the most comfortable. Where if you want to have like 8 to 80, an 8-year-old girl, an 8-year-old person bicycle, they like separate facilities is what's needed to make that happen. What are your thoughts on skate advocates joining forces with these active transportation or bridging that gap? Or have you found opposition maybe from other active modes? I guess my main question is, could those be, if we're pushing for separate facilities for active transportation, or the more popular modes like biking and walking? But where does skateboarding fit into that?
Well, it's interesting. I think that they should be integrated, and like as I said that, they highly value those separated facilities, and it's interesting because somewhere in northeast Portland, they were doing a bike path, and one of the cities was like, who else do we need to consider while talking and planning for this bike infrastructure? And then they got like nailed with a bunch of emails from skateboarders and longboarders and the Northwest Skate Coalition, and so they really want to be considered within these decision-making processes and included in these separated facilities as well. And I think that one of those last research questions, like how does it impact the comfort level of other users? I think that's important before we start integrating everything together. But I think that they're very compatible.
I also think there's a second open house for the Sullivan's Gulch at the Sullivan's Crossing Bridge that's going to be not a particular bridge, but when you guys go to that open house, you want to talk to them about skateboarding, I'll probably be there doing that.
I'll go with you.
Is that around 20th Avenue?
It says over 7 in the
I guess one last question from online and we can wrap it up. I guess the opposite. How do cycling advocacy groups see skateboarding?
I'm not sure exactly how. So I've read a few blogs, looking into that, and it really depends. Some people see them as just another person that they can pass, but some say that they're obstructive in the bike lanes, and so I mean it really depends. I think if the cyclist advocates are pushing for more inclusive networks, then they should definitely be teaming up with the skateboarders but there's obviously always conflict.
Well, with that, let's thank Michael. See everyone next week for our last session of the spring.
You want me to close this out for you, David?
Yeah.
Cool.
Right now?
This one with.
Oh, man. All right.